On paper, middleweight is arguably the most talent-rich, diverse, and exciting division in the sport. The top five, Bisping, Rockhold, Yoel, Jacare, and Weidman, are a terrifying group of evenly matched monsters. Beyond that, there's the greatest middleweight of all time, and a fresh cohort of rising contenders like Mousasi, Whitaker, and Gastelum. If the division was functioning properly, within 2 or 3 fights, almost anyone in the top 10 could conceivably be the champion. We should be witnessing a super competitive golden era and a series of incredible title fights. But the division isn't functioning properly, and instead of an unprecedented streak of high-level, glorious, gratuitous fucking violence, it actually feels like the middleweight belt has been commandeered for promotional purposes, and in a sense the division has been called off. The UFC went ahead and canceled a motherfucker. We have an incredible group of contenders, and an active champion defending his belt. But there doesn't appear to be any discernible link between the two. The champion and the division are operating completely independent of each other, over multiple consecutive title defenses, which is totally unprecedented in the UFC. Bisping's first title defense was against Dan Henderson, who from a merit perspective had no business fighting for a belt. The justification for that fight came from the fact that the 4 legitimate contenders had all just lost, except Yoel, who had just been popped for a banned substance. So at the time, and assuming it was in isolation, ignoring the rankings didn't seem totally outrageous. It seemed Bisping was simply a benefactor of good timing. In that fight, though, Bisping almost got finished by Hendo, and just about edged a decision over the 5 rounds. At the time, Dan Henderson was a 46-year-old declining legend, clearly showing his age in the octagon. He was ranked number 13 in the division, he hadn't won 2 consecutive fights in over 5 years, and he had 1 foot out the door. Hendo stated on many occasions that he was only fighting because he was getting a title shot. So considering how competitive that fight was, just how deep Bisping had to dig to win it, and Dan Henderson's plummeting place in the division, in order to maintain a sliver of credibility around the belt, there was an obvious and immediate need for Bisping to reestablish himself as the greatest fighter in the division by facing a legitimate contender, of which there are several qualified candidates available. As Joe Rogan said, why even have champions? If it's unclear who the best fighter in the division is, and we're given a series of title fights that only serve to further obscure the matter, what is the actual point of a champion? If your belt doesn't represent the best fighter in the division, then I hope it holds your trousers up. Otherwise, it has no function. Instead of restoring some movement to the backed-up traffic jam at middleweight, he's now facing a former welterweight who has never competed at middleweight and hasn't fought in almost 4 fucking years. Now, a lot of people have been saying that GSP deserves an immediate shot at whatever weight class he chooses. I'll come back to this later, but I would actually agree with that under normal circumstances. But under these circumstances, I would have expected more from the UFC. This is a clear and shameless case of profitability at the expense of enormous credibility. Bisping's 2 title defenses are starting to represent the single greatest departure from the philosophy that made the UFC what it is today. Many times over the years, Dana White has reiterated the sentiment that in the UFC, the best fight the best and the chips fall where they may. Obviously, there have been guys like Kimbo Slice and CM Punk, but at the very highest levels, where it matters most, the UFC have generally stuck to those principles, and their reward for doing so was that the value of the company grew 2,000-fold and they attracted millions of loyal fans. So if those principles have been so successful and have always drawn favorable comparisons to the framework of boxing, why deviate now? Well, despite all the shit that Bisping has been getting, I'd imagine he had very little to do with the decision, which likely revolves around GSP. With the UFC's 3 biggest stars all on hiatus, their best bet of salvaging the year is George. He's a former pay-per-view king, he's a proven megastar, and right now it seems like his interests are perfectly aligned with the organization's. They're both looking for a couple of huge fights, and by coming back at middleweight, they're guaranteed at least 2, a middleweight title shot and a welterweight title shot. So it's about squeezing every last motherfucking cent out of GSP. Now, you might have thought I was being a little dramatic when I said it feels like the division has been cancelled. I mean, it's just one fight. But it's already Bisping's second title defense, and there's a lot suggesting that the division will continue malfunctioning moving forward. Most people are already speculating that GSP won't defend the belt, and that's likely down to his size and the fact that he's been totally non-committal about doing so. It would make far more sense to return to welterweight in an attempt to snatch up a second belt at a much more natural weight class, or look for some less risky, higher profile super fights. One of the details about GSP's comeback is that he has to go through 3 more months of USADA testing. Initially, Bisping had stated he would fight Yoel in the spring, which obviously never happened. But the UFC had ample time to book that fight, and they still could. Bisping could easily fight Yoel, and GSP could come back and fight the winner 6 to 8 weeks after his USADA testing is complete, which is exactly the timeline George suggested on the MMA Hour. The UFC were fully aware that they were gonna eat a ton of shit for this fight. So the fact that they were unwilling to roll the dice on Bisping at the cost of enormous credibility and at odds with the company's traditional philosophy suggests to me that they simply couldn't. They couldn't roll the dice because GSP is unwilling to fight any other middleweight for the belt, which makes a title defense seem very unlikely. Bisping said it himself. GSP is moving up to fight a champion he perceives as weak. He also said that the UFC have been gunning for this fight since last October, which explains why the division has been left in a state of limbo. So although I can agree with GSP getting an immediate title shot, what I can agree with is GSP essentially freezing a division that should be on fucking fire so that the belt stays in the hands of the one man he wants to fight. Especially if his plan is to opportunistically swoop in, snatch the belt, before skipping away back down to welterweight. GSP will have essentially plundered the division, taken all the shine off the title, and left guys like Yoel and Jacare trying to pick up the pieces by fighting each other. Which is bullshit, because unlike Khabib, neither guy is carrying any fanfare. They need to build their hype by beating a legitimate champion, not by facing each other for a bunch of complete and utter interim bullshit. So GSP taking the belt will more than likely be a disaster for the middleweight division. But will a Bisping victory be any better? At the press conference, Bisping asked Dana to reassure the crowd that he just sent Dana a text message agreeing to fight Yoel 6 weeks after George, which was fucking hilarious. As if frustrated fans were gonna be like, oh, wait a minute. You mean Bisping already committed to fighting Yoel 6 weeks after George via the ironclad, legally binding format of a drunken text message? Oh, okay. I mean, give me a fucking break here. I was actually surprised Bisping came out with something so just silly. I mean, it's obvious Bisping was aware of the impending backlash. I can't even begin to discuss all the mental gymnastics he's been doing trying to placate the crowd and mitigate the criticism. But asking Dana to verify a text message? I mean, how stupid does he think we are? That was a funny fucking moment. Anyway, putting the silly 6-week timeline aside, what are the odds that Bisping will have a quick turnaround at all? Well, in Bisping's first title defense, he completely ignored the rankings and was rewarded with a revenge fight at home in the UK. In his second title defense, he again ignored the rankings while waiting patiently for the landscape to change, and was again rewarded with the single biggest payday of his career against a welterweight. So not only has Bisping been rewarded for completely ignoring the rankings, he has been increasingly rewarded for ignoring the rankings and for waiting for the changing landscape to produce a preferable matchup. The UFC set a terrible precedent with Bisping and then emphatically reinforced it. If you get used to being served steak dinners and then someone offers you a bowl of dog shit, then you're at least going to look around for a better offer. So I just do not see a quick turnaround for Bisping. If he didn't feel a need to fight Yoel after the Hendo performance, then it's a little naive to expect him to get motivated for Yoel after beating the greatest welterweight of all time for the biggest payday of his career. I'm not saying he won't fight Yoel, I just do not see a quick turnaround. And to be honest, I wouldn't blame him. GSP and Bisping both already have incredible legacies, and they're both nearing the end of their careers. If they weren't looking for those big paydays, then they'd have to be severely retarded. Both guys are just being smart here, and behaving perfectly rationally under the circumstances. Ultimately, you have to blame the UFC. They put both Bisping's title defenses together, so the buck stops with them. If Bisping's title reign is an aberration, then all we'll likely lose is a couple of years of incredible title fights. But if this represents a developing trend of profitability at the expense of enormous credibility, and senseless title fights, contrived title reigns, and frustrated contenders become a permanent fixture in the UFC, that could easily result in long-term fans becoming increasingly jaded with what looks less and less like a sport. The middleweight division is incredibly frustrating right now. If there were 3 or 4 divisions malfunctioning in a similar manner, then people who loved an organization that represented the best fighting the best and the chips landing where they may could easily start gradually tuning out, or even abandon ship altogether, which is a serious consideration. Now, although I don't blame the fighters for looking for the fight, they're both clearly aware of the backlash, and in my opinion, they've both been pretty deceptive and disingenuous in how they've defended the matchup. So I do want to look at some of their points. One of the things Bisping is saying is that, he doesn't make the fights. He only accepts them. So he's kind of been placing the blame on the UFC, which, as I mentioned, I agree with that. But if you recall, after the Hendo fight, Bisping was actively campaigning for a quick turnaround against Nick fucking Diaz, which is mind-blowingly ridiculous under the circumstances. So Bisping might not make the fights, but it's clear that if he did, they'd actually be way more ridiculous. His third title defense would probably be against BJ Penn, followed by CM Punk, then maybe a raccoon, a blow-up doll, some antique furniture, and so on and so on. So when he says, I don't make the fights, I always think, yeah, thank God for that. One of the points George made in a very short interview he did for UFC's website, he tried to frame the fight in a positive light from Yoel and Jacaré's perspective. He basically said they should be grateful they're getting fucked because having a huge star in a division will likely mean a bigger payday when they eventually do get their shot, which is actually 100% true if GSP was committed to defending the middleweight belt. But on the contrary, he's been pretty open about not being committed to defending it. And as I mentioned, his apparent commitment to fighting Bisping suggests he won't defend it. So this was a pretty blatant distortion of reality from GSP. Rather than a mega payday, Yoel and Jacaré will probably face each other in a fight that will sell about 4 pay-per-views. I mean, talk about pissing on someone's head and telling them it's raining. Really, the two guys have gone to some incredible lengths twisting reality to mitigate the backlash. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. The last thing I want to mention is something Bisping said in his rebuttal to Joe Rogan, where he expressed the idea that he's paid his dues. This is a sentiment that has been echoed all over the internet. The idea that Bisping deserves it. Now, Bisping has contributed enormously to this sport. He was the winner of The Ultimate Fighter Season 3. He popularized the sport in the UK. I mean, he holds a record for the most wins in UFC history. So he has paid his dues, and he has helped the sport grow in a massive way. But people say it as if he hasn't been compensated. Michael Bisping has made a shitload of money in the sport. Outside of pay-per-view points, he has the third highest career earnings in UFC history. He's also coached multiple stints on The Ultimate Fighter. He's a brilliant, entertaining analyst who likely has a career waiting for him behind the Fox desk. And he's also got a budding movie career. So I'm not saying Bisping doesn't deserve a big payday, but he has, at least to some extent, been rewarded for his contribution to the UFC. Because all of those opportunities are closely tied to the growth of the sport. But the problem with extending the term deserve to the title picture is that there's already a well-established functioning framework ingrained in the organization for determining who deserves what when it comes to title fights. And that is rankings, number one contenders, and title eliminators. So although I'm happy to see Bisping get paid, does he deserve these fights to the extent that UFC commentators are questioning the purpose of having belts? To the point that a sensational division loses all its momentum and a host of contenders like Jacare and Yoel are left in a state of limbo, fighting around in circles? Does Bisping deserve to squeeze a couple money fights out of the belt, even if it means the UFC's traditional philosophy goes right out the fucking window, and in its place, a terrible new precedent is set? I don't think so. And it is one slippery fucking slope.